thank you everybody for joining us this morning in our Glasgow Talks session. What we can learn from Sydney, Singapore, and Shanghai. So we're going to get a bit of a world tour this morning of Asian and Australasian experience. First of all, I'd like to thank continued support from Glasgow University Adam Smith Business School and from Clydesdale Bank's Virgin Money for their support for the Glasgow Talks series. Now, this morning we would like to make it relatively interactive, so please use the chat function if you want to raise questions throughout the session, but we will have a Q&A after we've heard from our speakers where you can, as ever, raise your virtual hand. So we will come to that soon. So, well, we're all experienced now in the global COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it's been having on our businesses, on our personal behaviours, everyday lives, etc. But we have seen many different approaches in different countries and cities to the tackling of the pandemic in response. And some of our international partners are here today to share their perspectives on their local response and the effect on their business community. So we want to see what we can learn from their different approaches. It's one of the strengths actually of the Chamber of Commerce network that we have an international network of British chambers in overseas markets, and you're going to get the opportunity to see that in action today. The UK, well, where are we? We're in vaccination mode at the moment as we're rushing through our vaccination program, but we have been in lockdown broadly since just after Christmas. So our city centres are all empty. Our schools are largely empty. We're still waiting for a roadmap to understand how we are going to exit these lockdowns, and we are still engaged in debate about the appropriateness of the level of business support that is being made available, particularly to those businesses that have been closed as a consequence of lockdown. So these are all issues that I am sure are shared all around the world, but we have with us three guests who are going to explain how they have seen the crisis play out in their cities and countries. We have James Dunn, Executive Director of British Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. We have David Kelly, who's the Executive Director of British Chamber of Commerce Singapore. And we have David McCready, OBE, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian British Chamber of Commerce. So I'm going to ask James to start off. James is as I said, is the Executive Director of British Chamber of Commerce Shanghai. He's lived and worked for the Chamber for the past 3 years and has a huge amount of knowledge on how British FTSE 100 and 250 businesses operate within the China market. Prior to his work in Shanghai, James has experience in the mining and infrastructure industries, having previously worked for construction companies in Nigeria. So James is going to share a little bit about the initial outbreak in Wuhan, response from the Chinese government, and how this has affected business in life in Shanghai. So over to you, James. Welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. That's a very nice introduction there. I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully this works well. Is that clear?
It is. You're on.
All right, good stuff. I thought, well, given that COVID-19 started in China, it'd probably be easier to take you all through a bit of a timeline in terms of the response from the China side, but also in terms of some of the policies that the Chinese government implemented to help alleviate some of the issues that businesses were facing. So I suppose this all started off towards late December 2019. Actually, I was in Shanghai at that point, and to be honest with you, we didn't know, we hadn't heard of any pneumonia cases or any issues. In terms of where Wuhan and Hubei is, as you can see on the map, it's central China. That's roughly about a 7-hour train ride on a bullet train west. So it's still pretty far away. Hubei itself as a province is probably nearly double the size of Scotland. So that's what you're looking at in terms of area. So a population of 12 million people of the city of Wuhan, and the province itself is approximately 60 million. And all of this happened really at a wrong time in itself, because you've got the lead up to Chinese New Year and what we would call Chunyun, which is basically a 40-day period coming up to Chinese New Year, where you see roughly 2.9 billion passenger journeys throughout the world. So that's Chinese people traveling to international locations to see their families on holidays, etc. But also in terms of domestically as well, you're seeing a huge amount of migration from particularly the tier 1 cities into tier 2, tier 3 and their hometowns. On the 23rd of January, this is when it started to get pretty serious. And the Chinese government then ordered to basically completely lock down a number of cities in Hubei, with a total number of cases rising to about 450. And in Shanghai, at that point, we weren't particularly concerned. But within the kind of the following week, this is when it started to kind of unravel in terms of the seriousness of this. So Wuhan suspended all public transport, including buses, metros, ferry lines, and all outgoing flights and trains were halted. What you would have seen as well is a couple of cases would have started to come up in Italy. And the reason for that is actually there's a lot of Italian automotive supply chain sitting in Wuhan. And there's direct flights between Wuhan and Italy, which is why you were seeing Italy kind of being impacted the most very early on. 2 days later, pretty much all provinces in mainland China, except Tibet, were declared level 1 public health emergency, which basically means all public gatherings prohibited, cinemas, tourist sites were closed until further notice. Again, this happened now at Chinese New Year. So effectively people are at home, people aren't working, businesses are closed. So it made it a little bit easier, I think, for the Chinese government to kind of get a hold on it. In February, early February, actually the UK government told British nationals to leave China, which to a certain extent was a mistake, because the Chinese shut the borders 2 months later, so people couldn't get back in. But what they did is they extended Chinese New Year's holiday, so to give people an extra week to stay at home. And communities across China as well started to ban visitors. So there was very much a societal effort to control and to make sure that people aren't traveling around. All schools stayed closed after Chinese New Year holidays, and schools didn't really return back until about June, which then it was nearly their summer holiday anyway. So schools remained closed, and obviously it was all online from then. Governments was issuing daily updates, a number of confirmed and suspected cases, and patients have been monitored. So effectively, there is an app, and basically you can track where all the active cases are, where they've been to, etc. They also implemented a QR code, which I will show you, which looks very similar to this. There's a green QR code, and it tells you basically where you've been, and if you've been to a high-risk area, it will turn red, and if it turns red, you will get a knock on your door very swiftly, and you will be escorted somewhere, premises somewhere within Shanghai, and you will probably have to stay there for the next 14 days. So they have very much a strict control on the population here. They know they have a good track and trace system. So they know where people are, they know where they're visiting. So when cases do pop up within 24 hours, they can pretty much collect all that data and track where people are going. I suppose all of this was, that really helped curb the spread of the virus, having lockdown. So even in Shanghai in February, basically most people were confined to their compounds. Now in China, most people are organized in compounds. You live in residential compounds, and each compound has a doctor, a local policeman, a community officer. So it's much more easier to control a large population when everyone's sat in compounds. Very much, we weren't allowed out the compounds for that. So we were allowed food deliveries, but pretty much you were confined into your space until roughly about the end of March. Sorry, early March. By early March, we started to see kind of newly confirmed cases drop to about 11. And then that's when basically China started to open up slowly. So in March, what we had then is people started to return to the office, but more on a rotationary basis. So you'd say HR and finance were generally in the office. Sales, marketing, the kind of the non-essential staff that don't need to be in the office were told to continue to work from home. And PPE packs were given to all staff and asked to avoid travel during peak times. And then basically all the companies would check people's temperatures and health codes every morning. And in Wuhan basically closed all of their temporary coronavirus hospitals and lockdowns as well towards the end of March. So they very much contained the coronavirus very quickly in China with a strong kind of hand of authority. And then the end of March, they decided that, well, as the international situation is getting worse, they decided to close its borders because it decided, well, it's easier to control people domestically rather than coming in internationally. And for more about 2 months, China kind of continued to improve. There weren't many cases coming on. And in May, you basically saw most of the businesses back into the office. And that's when the chamber then started to be able to do offline events. We had our first social mixer in May. I think we were the first chamber in China to actually do that. We had roughly about 100 people for that. So there was a lot of pent up demand because obviously people had been indoors for the past 2-3 months, and we were very much able to get back on with life quite quickly. In June, borders still remained closed, and that was the problem. And to some extent, actually, borders are still closed for China. So actually, from UK to China at the moment, there are no flights. So that's still an issue. Hotel quarantine was put in place, so it's 14 days mandatory quarantine, which means that when you fly into the country, you get a choice between a 2-star and a 4-star hotel, roughly about £25 a night, and you've got to do 14 days there and tested every day. Recently, we've had a few more cases in Shanghai, so that's now gone up to 21 days in hotels. And the reason why that's been is people have tested positive after 14 days. So to get more of a control on it, they've decided to increase it for 21 days. And I think Singapore is the same for that as well. So in terms of kind of restarting the economy, I will briefly push through this because there's quite a bit of information there, but kind of fiscal policies they introduced, so including tax cuts, fee exemption, cost reductions and subsidies. They understood that actually the SMEs were the key kind of driver behind restarting the economy. So making sure that small businesses are looked after. So the VAT for small businesses were exempted for a period. Some social insurance contributions by employees were exempted and halved for a time. Local governments were encouraged to waive urban land use taxes to encourage landowners to reduce and waive rents. And Shanghai government actually came to us in probably the end of February and started to visit some of the British SME members to ensure that they are getting these waivers for rents. So there was a real coming together, particularly on the Shanghai government perspective, in terms of helping British business in Shanghai and making sure that the pain is eased through some of these policies, which I've been here for 5 years in China, and I've not seen that level of support before. So that for me tells me a lot. In terms of monetary and financial policies, 12th of March, the banking sector provided 1.4 trillion yuan of credit to the economy and implemented a series of financial support measures, particularly for SMEs, including reducing interest rates, increasing debt rollovers and renewal loans, and also industry policies focusing on large infrastructure investment projects and supply chain. So it's very much kind of grab the bull by the horns and kind of push the economy forward. And I think the Chinese government have actually done a very good job at pushing the economy. And one of the other aspects as well is they wanted to increase consumer spending. Chinese consumers have a lot of spending power, and obviously with the international borders shut, they're spending a lot of that money internally now, whether that's flying to different parts of China, whether that's luxury retail. A lot of that money is now being spent within the economy, and I think that's really helped boost and kick-started the economy to where we are. And lastly, kind of just trade policies focusing on stabilization and foreign trade investment as well. So launched a package of policies to stabilize international trade and foreign investments to continue to further open the market. So overall, I think they were the key policies really to kind of push the Chinese economy forward. And I think to some extent, some main lessons and experiences here is obviously time is crucial. The first policy was to stop the outbreak. So no matter what the damage was to the economy, it was stop everything. Let's get it under control, and then we push forward. And they've been very, very strict on isolation policies, social distancing, and utilizing strict quarantines. So for example, we just had a member just about last week, and he was traveling into an area of northern China, and he literally just went into one district, drove through it, and he's been flagged to go into a red zone area, which means that he now has to do 21 days in a very rural location in China by himself. So this is how strict it is over here. I think information transparency is also necessary. As you know, the Wuhan government lost probably about 3 weeks. That would have stopped preventing the outbreak due to kind of faulty public health crisis measures and information reporting systems. So utilizing digital technology, big data and cloud computing, I think is important to get a real grasp of the situation. And whatever it takes, macroeconomics policies are fundamental as well. So to prevent potential economic meltdown, the Chinese not only provided fiscal support, but also created monetary and financial policies to prevent economic recession. So again, saving SMEs was for them kind of the key strategic step to ensure that, with the Chinese economy going to restart. And I think lastly as well is kind of mobilization on medical workers as well. There's within a day's notice, you can mobilize a force here. So medical workers from around China will go straight into Hubei to help fight that cause. And it's quite scary really how quickly they can mobilize staff together to be able to target something. And I think lastly, in terms of hospital preparation and organization, and I think China pretty much learned this from SARS back in early 2000s, a quite similar virus, but not so transmissible. Was having designated facilities to be able to look after those affected. And as you saw, Wuhan, I think it was 6 hospitals in the end. They created 6 hospitals in a matter of 2 weeks. So that's the level of scale and manpower that they have. And in terms of case diagnostics, it's just having testing. They're very quick at testing. If there's any cases, you will be knocked on the door and you will have to do a test, and within 6 hours you will have that result. So they're very quick to have that level of control. In terms of the chamber, just to kind of lastly touch upon that, the chamber last year was, I think, more important than ever. Actually, is we're bringing together really a community of businesses, individuals, to ensure that, you know, we're all helping each other in a time of need. And obviously being away from home and expats being stuck and particularly separated from families, I think, you know, that's when really the chamber came into its own. So, you know, this year we are still doing offline events. There are still COVID cases in China, not many, but there still are, and we still have to manage small little outbreaks. But overall, we're in an okay position in China. The international borders still remain closed, and they will probably remain closed, I think, probably for the next year. And I think on a Shanghai perspective side is being able to support the members being able to get vaccines now. So that's kind of where we are. I appreciate it's quite a lot of information in a short period of time. And I've tried to skip through a year's worth of information quite swiftly. So if you have any questions, you can let me know later.
Thanks very much, James. And we do have some questions beginning to come in, but I'm going to hold them. I've got a note of them, and we'll come back to them after we have heard from, next up, David Kelly, who is the Executive Director of British Chambers of Commerce in Singapore. David is a chartered marketeer, joined the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore in 2019. He's lived in Singapore since 2015. Previously worked at the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology, and he spearheaded development and execution of a completely new global marketing strategy, which helped to see the Institute double in size. So David's going to share a little bit about Singapore and its experience. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you for the Chamber for having me as well. It's nice to reconnect with the UK again. I deliberately put that picture up there because I'm still sprouting my lockdown beard. So I deliberately wanted to show you what I used to look like before all of this, and I've gone a lot grayer because wow, what a time, certainly over here. So look, I mean, this was quite a difficult presentation to put together because there's lots of different perspectives I think that we can sort of cover as a group. So what I thought I'd do is just to tell you a little bit about Singapore, because we've got very different challenges to China and some of our neighbouring countries. Just talk to you about the process of what happened, a little bit about communication, stimulating the economy, and then a bit of a view, hopefully a bit of a positive view looking forwards as well. It has been interesting. I've not been back to see the UK. I've not had the love actually moment with my family since 2019. I saw there was a question that came in around mental health, and that is definitely something that we're doing, and I'll come on to that in a bit later. But I might not have all of the answers because a lot of the tectonic plates are still moving. But hopefully this will paint a bit of a picture in terms of the journey that we've been on. One thing just to mention actually, which is hopefully a bit of good news, is that you know, the way that the vaccine is being rolled out in the UK has been well received over here. It's actually filling people with quite a lot of confidence in terms of seeing what the UK is doing, which is great. So just a little bit about Singapore, just to put it into context. Unlike the size of China, we are fairly small. We've got about 5.7 million people within the population totally. Just over 1.5 million of those are expatriates and foreign workers. On the size of an island, the same size as Anglesey. So we're a city-state, which I'm sure you know. But one of the really interesting things about Singapore and some of the challenges that we've had is that it is considered one of the hubs for Southeast Asia in terms of being that transitional hub into other countries and being a place for regional businesses to host their regional HQs. So some of the challenges here have been looking at the labour markets in other countries and how to manage people online. And I guess, you know, in the overall grand scheme of things, it's fairly, I say this sort of a bit flippantly, but it's a bit easier to close down one airport, one cruise terminal, and 2 bridges to Malaysia than maybe other countries will be having. So I just wanted to sort of set that as a bit of context. So as of yesterday, we've got about just under 60,000 cases of just under 6,000 cases of coronavirus. That equates to about 0.001% of the population, so fairly small, only 29 deaths, and a really good recovery rate as well there. And the main areas that Singapore sort of broke down where the cases were being recorded were the community spread, so people going for meetings and seeing people socially, the migrant workers that were working in areas like the port, delivering some of the main services. Singapore is one of the largest transnational ports, the largest bunkering port in the world as well. And then overseas travellers coming in here into the country as well. So Singapore did a really good job of sort of breaking those down into sort of 3 areas and then tackling each 3 of those groups in very specific ways, which hopefully I'll share a bit more going on. So the first test case that we had was on the 20th of January 2020, so just over a year ago, and that person was tested positive on the 23rd of Jan, 3 days later, having seen the symptoms. But this story, as James has alluded to in his presentation, does go back a number of years to the 2003 Sars virus as well. During, and I think the reason why we wanted to mention this is because during that initial period of the epidemic, there were things that were being tested, like public communication, how the government was delivering messaging to people, what was going to happen around public education to educate Singaporeans and those that are living here in terms of how to deal with things like this. So there was already a test base here in terms of having seen similar trends that were coming through in terms of COVID. And I think generally what that demonstrated, and I think how that's helped Singapore to remain fairly open, is that Singaporeans did sort of develop a good high level of trust and a satisfaction with the government in essence, and confidence within the institutions and the decisions that Singapore was making. So as I sort of move on and explain what's happened over the last 12 months, more specifically bringing it back to COVID, I think it's just worth highlighting that we had been through this journey before to some extent. So the borders closed on the 23rd of March, causing a lot of disruption to international businesses here. But one of the things that the government did straight away was implement a contact tracing plan immediately. So ensuring that people were being tested and that those that had symptoms were being clustered into groups against those 3 areas around the community, around international travellers, and around the migrant workers as well in the dormitories. And one of the things that Singapore did was publish the numbers. So they kept everything really, really transparent. And I'll give you a good example of this, because my next bullet says QOs, and that stands for a quarantine order. And I was one of the unlucky ones that was in close proximity to case 1166 when they were promoting and actually telling people who was getting or who was testing positive for COVID. And what it did was the program for quarantine orders and the process of contact tracing and testing allowed the person that I was with who tested positive for COVID to go into a hospital and be looked after. And he was there for about 6-7 weeks and he's absolutely fine, which is good news, and a bit older than me. Whereas I and the people that he were with in close proximity were stuck in a quarantine order straight away. And what that basically meant was I was not allowed to leave my apartment for 14 days. I had to temperature check myself 3 times a day, in the morning, in the lunchtime, and in the evening. And not only that, but a lot of the workers that were working for Singapore Airlines and the hospitality industry were put into a program to ring people that were on quarantine orders to make sure that they were at home and that they were not leaving their homes, and then therefore putting the rest of the community at risk. So it was very, very strict, but absolutely rightly so. And just as a side note, if I had broken that rule, having signed the quarantine order contract, I would have received up to a 6-month jail sentence and a $10,000 fine. So they take it really, really seriously here in terms of breaking the rules. So that strict regime, that strict way of controlling things has worked in terms of stopping people from heading out. So I served my 14 days of quarantine order and then had a couple of days with my mates having a beer and trying to catch up with people, socially distanced and sensibly. And then we went into what the Prime Minister called circuit breaker for at the beginning of April, which was effectively a lockdown for everybody here. So that was a way that non-essential workplaces could be closed to stop people moving on the MRTs. Shortly after that was all happening, it was made compulsory for anybody that was leaving their home to wear a mask, which is very sensible. Again, a learning that they picked up from the Sars virus as well. But also, what it also, and again, there was a fine if you didn't wear your mask. But really, the closures meant that schools were closed, preschools were closed. We went through all of the process that you guys are going through at the moment around teaching kids at home and still trying to juggle your job. There was a little bit of easing up around May, where some food shops, barber shops, a couple of manufacturing plants and laundry, sort of essential services really were starting to open up. So Singapore's plan really was to contain everything. So as soon as the community spikes were going up, they were trying to snub those really quickly and get them absolutely cut out. So post-circuit breaker, when we were able to come and see people again and socialise sensibly, there is still a massive emphasis on early detection. So the sooner you can detect any sort of symptoms, they take you out of the community, and they really monitor any clusters that have been building here. Over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we had a small spike. And there were 4 very small clusters that they were worried about. Again, they nipped those right in the bud, and they've made sure that those that were testing positive or those that had symptoms were at home, or they were looked after in the hospital system here as well. The other thing that Singapore has done, and James alluded to it in China as well, was mandatory quarantine for those that were travelling back to Singapore when they could. And there is actually still a travel ban from the UK at the moment, which you're probably aware of. So for those that are travelling from other countries, serving their quarantine in other countries, as long as you haven't been in the UK for 14 days prior to your arrival, you can arrive into Singapore with the permission of the Ministry of Manpower and the Ministry of Trade and Industry. But you are mandated to serve 14 days in a government hotel at your own expense or at your company's expense, and that's around about 2,000 Sing dollars. So it's fairly expensive. And then you have to serve your stay-at-home notice for 7 days at home. So it's a 21-day quarantine time in total. It's quite a horrible process, actually. If you're coming through, you land, you get your test, and then you're bussed with a load of other people to a hotel. You don't know where you're going to be. You just got to get on with it and deal with it. And so they take it very, very seriously in terms of creating those sort of safe bubbles to make sure that those that are travelling into the country aren't going into the community. We're still in sort of this post-circuit breaker mode at the moment, and default is still working from home. So the government is still saying to companies, the backstop position is, if you don't need to go into the office, don't travel if you don't need to. Certainly travel within Singapore. Restaurants are all closed by 10:30, which I guess for you guys in the UK sounds like a bit of a luxury at the moment, and it is a bit of a luxury for us at the moment. But they're still making sure that that restaurants are serving food and no alcohol being served after 10 o'clock, and you've got to clear off and you've got to go home by 10:30. No live sports, no entertainment, no live music is occurring either. And we're still sort of really reliant on technology. Everybody carries their mobile phones along. I've now got 2 battery packs because the Bluetooth tracing on my app absolutely drains my battery. But what it does do is it allows people to very, very quickly to detect if they've been in contact with potential cases here. So keeping everybody very, very safe. Now, put a slide in here about communication, because I think one of the things that Singapore has done really well is it's communicated and been incredibly transparent about the journey that we've all been on. And I think that's provided a lot of support, and it's sort of quelled a lot of the worry, and it's quelled a lot of the rumours, really, because we're all getting news from the government. So on the right-hand side, you can actually see a screen grab of my mobile phone about an hour ago, telling me that there were 23 imported cases, 25 new cases of COVID in Singapore today. And that constant information is coming through about twice a day, which is really, really helpful just to sort of see where things are going. And it's allowing us to sort of keep real time what's going on. So that transparent communication has been really good. And as a chamber, we've got an information hub as well for the business community too, which is constantly being updated with all of the rules and the regs. So we've taken that on. One of the things that I must praise our High Commissioner for is, and again, going back to that question about mental health, I think one of the things that we were a bit worried about around Christmas was that a lot of people are going to be missing their families. A lot of people a number of people that I know are in the position where they've got elderly family members that aren't very well, and a lot of worry there. So the British business community, just similar to what James was saying, did really pull together, and we tried to provide that support mechanism and just try and keep people together and just keep everybody happy and spirited. One of the things that Singapore is quite good for, if you're based here, is that it's not a far trip or a hop to Bali or to other places around the region which are quite luxurious, and obviously that's being stuck somewhere quite small can be a bit of a challenge. So in terms of stimulating the economy, I would say the 5 sectors that were hit the hardest were the sort of travel and tourism, entertainment, F&B, offline retail and high street stores, and aviation. And Singapore has recorded their worst ever economic recession in history from last year. Singapore is incredibly dependent on trade and cross-border flow of people from Malaysia and Indonesia, where talent comes in. And as that ASEAN hub, they have been hit very, very hard from this, with around about 83% of visitor reductions from 2019. So in terms of flights and all the ancillary businesses that make up travel and tourism and the hotel and hospitality space and entertainment space around here, it's been a real challenge. But what the government did do to try and stimulate the economy is, and sort of having fairly deep pockets, they contributed just over 97 billion Sing dollars into 5 budget packets throughout the year, and they were run through various different schemes, from a job support scheme to help keep people in jobs, to a solidarity payment where Singaporeans were actually given $600 in cash to actually try and stimulate the smaller businesses in the economy, the local businesses as well, which was all part of just trying to kickstart the economy again. And then latterly, there was a huge issue of around about 320 million Sing dollars worth of vouchers that Singaporeans could use in places like the zoo and the aquarium, just to try and get people going and to encourage that domestic tourism as well. So the government's been quite very sort of supportive of businesses, international and local businesses, to help keep people employed and help keep money being spent into the economy again. I mentioned the quarantine when people come in, that has kept people in jobs. So those that are serving in hotels and that are cooking food from different restaurants are actually helping that quarantine piece when people do land back in Singapore. And now the restaurants are open and they seem to be doing quite well, and they're able to look at their costs in a slightly better way, because they know what their capacity is, because you've got to book to go somewhere now, and you can only have a maximum of 8 people on a table. So that we're seeing the restaurant industry start to pick up a little bit, which is, I think, a bit of a good news story in terms of what might happen at the end of this too. There was also a massive focus on retraining, reskilling, and creating around about 100,000 jobs and traineeships for Singaporeans as well. So they were very, very conscious that there's a lot of talent out there that can be redeployed into other areas that were needed. And that was something that the international chamber community and the trade associations played a part in, to try and support that, to try and find opportunities. And it was quite interesting. We surveyed our members. 66, I think it was just under 66% of our members said their salaries were remaining the same before pre-COVID for all staff, and that they were looking to actually recruit more staff as well going forward. It's been sort of a tale of two sides, really. But Singapore has really, really tried to ensure that people have stayed employed. And a big part of what we've been doing is trying to support that effort as well. The picture at the bottom is it was just before lockdown, actually, where we met with Minister Chan Chun Sing, the Minister for Trade and Industry, around how we can use the chamber network and use the business community to support the stimulation of the economy as well. So that's a typical picture of Singapore. That's what it looks like, very glamorous from my bedroom window. However, it was really horrible. Stuck on the 18th floor, not able to go out anywhere. It did feel like a bit of a prison cell for 55, 56 days. So there were some significant downsides to it, and the challenging thing was managing a team as well that were all doing the same thing and trying to keep everybody buoyed. So lots of things that I'm sure we're all doing around virtual drinks with friends, etc. has all been part of that journey. But it was pretty miserable, I can tell you, not having a garden and not being able to not just being able to get out and taste some fresh air was pretty miserable. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom. And just sort of looking forward, I just wanted to sort of present just a couple of slides on some specific areas where there are opportunity for businesses. And I wanted to play this back to the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce community as well, because if you're in these areas, and we might be able to help you with some of this stuff. So education and training is right up there. You know, we've had to think differently about providing education. EdTech has gone through the roof here in Singapore in terms of different ways of delivering education and remote learning, and supporting students through journeys in creating sort of hybrid internships with companies has been really interesting. So we've seen a huge influx of EdTech businesses coming through. Real estate is looking quite interesting. We're seeing relatively stable rental prices here, which is going to have an impact, but we're seeing lots of different companies move in different ways in terms of working in co-locating spaces. And there's been a big push in terms of the fintech space as well. I'm looking at how people are using different tech services and financial services. All the way through to medtech, to engineering projects, transport logistics and travel and tourism. And we're starting to find that as things are starting to pick up, the implementation of technology and the learnings that we've had over last year are starting to play really well for technology businesses that are working in those sectors. There have been some natural things that have slowed down. So the engineering sector, certainly the built environment space has slowed down massively in terms of construction projects and the building of the new Terminal 5 and the new runway here at Singapore. And so there are projects that are now starting to feel like they're moving a bit, but there is some opportunity there. So finally, I guess, you know, Singapore does remain and will continue to plan for the longer term. And I think that does make it a fairly stable place in terms of operating an organization here. And I think that the support packages that they've put through to businesses to keep people employed have demonstrated that. But what has been quite nice being an expatriate here and not a Singaporean is that there has been a feeling that Singapore has taken care of everybody regardless of nationality. So we have felt all very, very well looked after, and we all respect the rules here, which has made things a bit easier in terms of containing everything. And there's a real push, as I've just mentioned, around tech and talent, and Singapore's very, very open to this. So it does feel like there are some great opportunities in terms of that trade piece, certainly around the recent free trade agreement signed between Singapore and the UK just before Christmas. There are some interesting things coming through there. And I think that collection of keeping things safe, of reopening safely, does maintain that level of confidence. You probably would have heard that the World Economic Forum was due to be held in May here in Singapore. It's been pushed back to August. I think that is another good indicator and litmus test that Singapore's looking at the safest way to run events and to keep the country open but running as well as they can. In terms of conferences at the moment, we are up to 50 people without having to have a COVID test. So things feel like they're starting to happen. And I'm getting a lot of pressure from my members saying, well, great, if we can get 50 people in a room, can we do it? It's not all that pleasant. You've got to keep your mask on all day. You can't network across tables. So it's still very, very, very strict. But there's some great exciting stuff here around the recent announcement from the Prime Minister in the UK and certainly the Secretary of State Liz Truss around the CPTPP and how Singapore is part of that and the opportunities for UK businesses. So with that, we've got an interesting time coming up. It's Chinese New Year in a couple of weeks, so it'll be interesting to see how these things are moving and how people are sticking to the rules. But I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour of how there has been a lot of control. We felt quite safe here. It feels like things are sort of returning a little bit more to normality. And we're just trying to do as much as we can as a chamber just to keep everybody connected and keep that representation back to Singapore government, UK government, to industry, and to ensure that we're trying to support as much as we can businesses support here.
Thanks very much, David. That was excellent, and we've got a few questions that have come in from that as well. But let me speed on to our next and final speaker, David Mccready, who has just in the Queen's birthday honours been made in OBE, so congratulations to you, David. He's been CEO at Australian British Chambers of Commerce since 2010, and prior to his role at the Chamber, held a number of roles, including with cricket in New South Wales, the Hunter Business Chamber. He's also a non-executive chairman of the ECS Botanics. He's going to give us a sense of what's been happening in Australia. David, over to you. Oh, David Mccready.
Yeah, classic. You're on mute, David moment there, Stuart. So thank you, everyone. It is getting late. It is 8:45 here in Sydney, and yeah, look, it's Friday night, and to be honest, I should be out at one of the many drinking establishments or restaurants in Sydney, seeing as they're open again now, and we're back to a level of normality of life. But I'm here enjoying your company and have very much enjoyed the presentations prior to mine. I'm just going to share my screen, so apologies to just as I do that, get ourselves underway. It's been really interesting tonight, and thank you very much, Stuart, and to the team, Richard and Alan and the team at the Glasgow Chamber for the opportunity to talk to you tonight, or this morning your time. And it's great to see a couple of my great colleagues from our part of the world talking to you as well. The Australian experience has been probably quite different, and it's been great to hear from David and James about what's been happening in China and what's been happening in Singapore. Australia, I heard David talk about how big Singapore is and size, and earlier about how big the province that Wuhan is in, being twice the size of Scotland. Australia is about the size of Europe, and we only have 25 million people. So there's quite a bit of space. So social distancing, broadly speaking, is not that difficult. A little bit more difficult in the city centres, but broadly speaking, we go okay. What I thought I'd do today is just quickly, as everyone's done, is just sort of run through a bit of timeline from an Australian perspective, try and give you a bit of a flavour of what's happened, where we've got to, and then what's next. And really looking at from the two angles, one around health, and then the second one being around, what's the economic situation. So to do that, I'll see if I can get my slides to work. So major points of interest, I think we heard that the border out of Hubei province was closed in January. Well, that was when we got our first case from 4 travellers in China, arrived in Melbourne with the coronavirus, and we closed our border really quickly with direct flights to China. We started activating a health plan that was part of a pandemic planning scheme that we had in place. Our pandemic scheme wasn't perfect. I think every time you try and pre-plan for a major disaster, you're always going to miss something. But it seems to have gone reasonably well. March was when the world really fell apart for us, as I think everybody sort of experienced it more broadly. Interestingly, that was a point in time that I decided to leave Australia, go to the UK for a couple of weeks, and actually had to cut my trip short. But our first death from coronavirus was at the beginning of March. Our first economic stimulus package was on the 12th of March. On the 14th of March, that's while I was in the UK, they started saying, well, you got to, the Prime Minister announced he had to do a 14-day self-isolation on return from overseas. So I got on a quick flight home. And it's also when we started doing contact tracing. So really early in the piece, as we started to get case numbers starting to escalate. On the 20th, so just after I arrived home, fortunately, Australia closed the border. Although I'm being a resident, I was fine to come in, and we're still bringing residents home, but very, very slowly from the UK and elsewhere in the world. Not long after I arrived home, the 21st of March, we had 14-day mandatory hotel quarantine. We basically went into a soft lockdown that got a little bit harder over a couple of week period. Schools closed, non-essential services closed. I remember being in the UK on the, must have been about the 14th or thereabouts, Sunday evening, Boris Johnson's press conference where he told you basically the next day, if you can work from home, do. That message didn't really resonate in Australia until about a week later. But we had a very, very low threshold in terms of cases at that point in time. Very quickly after that, we had the second lot of stimulus packages announced, including what we call JobKeeper, which is very similar to the British government's furlough scheme. Slightly different in that with JobKeeper, the idea is you keep working for your employer as much as you possibly can, and we will support you to do that. If you can't work, you're an employee at a cafe or an airline worker or what have you, and we're not flying planes, we're not serving coffees, you're just staying at home, then yes, we pay you still. We didn't pay 80%, we just paid a flat rate, which was above the rate that an unemployed person would receive, but certainly significantly less than a lot of people might have been receiving previously. So it was an interesting balancing act. But the very key part of that, and probably to David's point about making sure SMEs were engaged, it was a really strong driver to maintain that connection between employees and their employer. So the government payment went to your employer. So we at the Chamber actually availed ourselves of this because 2/3 of our revenue normally comes from events, and we couldn't run any events physically. So we got into a situation where we need to use it. Basically, the government pays us the money, and we then pass the money directly on to our employees. And that keeps that connectivity with your employees, but they're absolutely able to work for you. I remember hearing stories about furlough where people weren't allowed to send emails to you in case that was deemed as work and all sorts of things. None of that existed in the same way here. It was absolutely about try and be as productive as you can in a really difficult situation. The job seeker payment was the normal unemployment benefits was raised to reflect the fact that a lot of people who normally wouldn't be unemployable suddenly were, just purely because whole industries, particularly going back to what David Kelly said earlier, tourism, aviation, those sorts of things, anything which had any travel element to it, any coffee shops, services, restaurants, those sorts of things, all of those sorts of things just overnight evaporated. So those sorts of places, if they had laid people off and they're a little bit slow in getting this package out, but it all happened so quickly, they did a remarkable job. And in fact, they actually made the window possible that if you'd laid somebody off, if they'd been working for you a month prior to the date that was the cutoff, you could actually re-employ them and put them on JobKeeper through your program. So it was a very generous and engaged way for government to behave, unlike normal Australian governments and probably unlike normal British governments, to be frank, as well. Range of safety net measures started to be rolled out, including telehealth, which we've been trying to get into Australia for years. Finally, a disaster comes and yes, we can show our innovative skills and roll out thousands and thousands of telehealth consultations. And then really in April, we thought we might have been through it. The COVID Safe app, which was the government's contact tracing app, I can try and compete to show you what it looks like. It's got a horrible green colour. It's a really beautiful green, but it tells you that there have been 6 new cases in Australia in the last 24 hours, all of which were acquired overseas and are from returned travellers. There are currently 55 active cases, and it will tell me if at some point in time I've been near somebody who has had COVID. So we'll wait and see. I've yet to have had the pleasure, or unfortunately have the pleasure. So by April, we were flattening the curves. We really got down to single-digit days across the country. So our lockdowns got eased. Our schools, which have been closed, came back to life. And then we moved into June, and that's where we really suffered. Not here in Sydney, where I live, but in Victoria and Melbourne. They had an outbreak from a quarantine hotel. which unfortunately led to quite a long lockdown in Victoria. It was rather challenging for them. There are a lot of cases, broadly speaking, from an Australian perspective. A very small number of cases, all up from a global or a number of other countries' perspective. But it took a long time for it just to get to close that curve off. And I'll show you a graph later that will point that out. Victoria recorded its first 0 cases domestically acquired for the first time since the 9th of June on the 26th of October. So it shows you it took a long time to actually bring back what was a reasonably significant outbreak back down to 0. But and we actually had a day, we started having days in November where there were no community transfers of COVID that we're aware of. There's still a reasonable rate of testing. It's not as high as what government would like, but it's still reasonably strong. It's just hard to convince people when you have 0 days after 0 days with good testing numbers to still go, I've woken up, maybe I had too many drinks last night, or I've walked past a tree that gives me hay fever and you're asking me to go and get my nose swabbed. People are a little bit skeptical at the moment, but there still seems to be a reasonable rate of testing happening. So as you can see on this slide, we've had a number of outbreaks, very small. The outbreak in Adelaide, I think, was 5 people. The outbreak, there were 28 on one day that all got tested. Basically, our contact tracing, particularly in New South Wales, is very good. But we've learnt the lessons over the period in different states and shared as much of that knowledge about how to contact trace very well. So we've done well at sort of locking down, closing off a small area, getting as many people in that area to test as possible, putting the people who have tested positive into quarantine, all the people who test initially into quarantine until you get a result, and going forward. We had an outbreak last week in Perth. They've got a lockdown that finishes in about 2 hours from now. Melbourne, we decided we'd hold the Australian Open. So we brought people from all over the world through a process into Melbourne. And so we've had one case down there. As a break, one case probably isn't the end of the world. But so here's a look at the charts for Australia. Number of daily reported cases. You can see we never got over 700 reported cases in one day. And comparatively to other countries, I know we're only 25 million, but reasonably well handled. And as you can see, we've continually bobbled around the bottom of that over a long period. And the increases over time, the old flattening the curve conversation. Obviously, we did a reasonably good job for a little while until the Melbourne outbreak, which really hurt us quite badly in terms of total number of cases. But still, given everything, 30,000 cases at this point, I think we've done remarkably well. When I checked today, we had 9 new cases. 1 was locally acquired in Melbourne. 8 were in hotel quarantine. 52 active cases in total. 28,000 cases in total across the whole period, and 909 deaths, which obviously nobody likes to have those numbers, but comparatively to other places, we've done remarkably well. So just quickly, in terms of the economic crisis, to give you some context, Australia was on the back of 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth. The last time that we had suffered 2 quarters in a row of negative growth was in 1991, in what was famously at the time called, by the Prime Minister at the time, Paul Keating, the recession we had to have. Clearly, we had to have it because we had 28 years of uninterrupted growth. And there were numerous times where we had a quarter of negative growth. But as you can see on this slide, we got absolutely smashed. But the good news is that, as you can see there's a small bar as the main line sort of starts, as the through the year line drops through the curve, through the plane, and then a much bigger, but it's about 7.5% drop in GDP in the June quarter. But the pleasing thing is September quarter has gone remarkably well. We expect the December quarter, Christmas was, retailers are reporting really strong growth. Across the economy, we think we've done pretty well. So we're hoping for a pretty good number for the last quarter of 2020, which remarkably would mean a reasonably good year all up. Although the total GDP year on year would be lower overall, but at least positive sign. And when you look at the next chart, I think you get the idea that the V-shaped recovery is what we're hoping to continue on with here in Australia. Services side on being the dark blue, really sharp and very strong in the positive direction, and goods equally has done reasonably well. Unemployment has been an issue. Before the JobKeeper came in and where things were happening, mind you, there'd been a little bit of cutting before coronavirus actually turned up, so it didn't particularly land at a great time in terms of the broader economy, but it's obviously recovered very well there. A drop of about 800,000 jobs, but as you can see, most of those have returned. So we're actually doing really well. We are the lucky country after all. So what's the response of government been? Well, our financial year in Australia is a July 1 to June 30 financial year. So in the 2019-20, which basically covers from the start of the pandemic to June 30, 2020, they spent 55.2 billion. 82.5 is projected in this financial year up to June 30, 2021. And then it tapers off over the next couple of years. Our JobKeeper payments end in March. There's no news at this point about how they'll be redirected or reshaped, but we're very hopeful that the Federal Treasurer will look favourably on those industries that are still really struggling. Our borders are closed still, our international borders. At the moment, as somebody who lives in Sydney, I can travel to Queensland. I couldn't travel there at Christmas time. I can travel to Victoria. I can travel to the ACT, but 2 weeks ago I couldn't travel there. I can't travel to Western Australia. I can travel to South Australia. I can travel to Tasmania. But at various times there's been quarantines in between states, all sorts of things. There's been a clear direction this afternoon from the Prime Minister that they actually formed at the beginning of the pandemic a new body. We've had traditionally a thing called the Council of Australian Governments, which is an addition of all the different state premiers and the Prime Minister. They've changed that into a thing called National Cabinet, which has a bit more grunt, and it's been a far more effective and more collaborative approach to things going forward. Today they've been in conversation. Haven't heard the finals, but I've heard some preliminary reports saying that the federal government's going to take control of the internal state borders, which shouldn't exist because when we federated as a country in 1901, all of those things were meant to disappear. But on that note, I know that there's plenty of people who want to ask questions. We've probably only got a little time left. So I'll pass back to you, Stuart, and thank you very much for having me on this evening.
Thank you very much, David. There you have it, a picture from Shanghai, Singapore, and from Sydney. So thank you very much. We've got some questions that have come through on the chat, and I just wanted to pose a few of those first. We've got about 10 minutes, so not a huge amount of time, so quite brief answers would be quite helpful. First of all, just a thought on vaccination approach and therefore the expectation of how much further restrictions might be expected to lift in the weeks and months ahead. So can I just pose that first of all to James? James, are you on mute?
There we go. Basically, at the moment, there's only the Chinese vaccines which are available in China. It is not mandatory at this stage, and basically, it's been offered to frontline workers, Chinese students who are studying overseas. There has been international schools approach to be able to take the Chinese vaccine, and there's still, I suppose, a question mark if people are still willing to take it. The Pfizer vaccines are hopefully able to be approved here in the next month or so. So still not mandatory, and it's not really slowing down anything on this side. So I think as China's cases are very low and the economy is pretty much open, there's no real massive demand to be taking vaccines at this stage.
And the international borders will therefore remain closed then for some time yet.
I suspect for the next year for China.
Right, gosh, that's interesting. David, in Singapore, vaccines and their impact on restriction lifting.
Yeah, so Singapore has the government have set a sort of a slightly movable deadline of Q3 of this year to get the population vaccinated. So they've currently got the Pfizer vaccine and the Sinovac vaccine here. They've been vaccinating senior ministers and those frontline workers, similar to James, but also those on the coalface of the maritime industry to get the portal moving as well. So the rollout is, I don't know the details in terms of when foreigners, for example, can get access to that. One of the things that has seemingly come up, and I think this is in relation to the extension of the stay-home notice from 14 days to 21 days, is that I think they're just keeping an eye on the asymptomatic carriers and what that looks like. I think that's going to have an impact on whether people can travel. So if they haven't got symptoms but they're carrying the virus, for example, that it's going to be harder to track. So I think, like James, I mean, I'm putting a mental piece into not go home to the UK until Q1 of next year, and Q1 of next year at least. But things are moving sort of almost weekly, really. Again, like the World Economic Forum moving from May to August is a good example of that, where they're trying to make sure that everything is as safe as it can be. So overall, vaccine rollout until the end of Q3 this year is the plan from the government. They've got a series of centres that they've already set up. There'll be a bit of internal communication to Singaporeans here, but I think they're just worried about that asymptomatic piece, and before they start opening up wider conferences and international delegates, which will have an impact on travel.
Thanks very much. And David in Sydney, vaccines and the likely impact on restrictions.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I appreciate it. Because we've had such minimal cases, the federal government, I know that, you know, in the UK, for example, you've got emergency powers to it's been approved on an emergency basis, the vaccines. The Therapeutic Goods Administration, which does our similar process, has gone through the full array of testing. There is no emergency application in this, and Pfizer has been approved here. AstraZeneca we expect to be approved in the coming days. And the others not that far after that. In terms of provision of vaccine here, there's none yet available. The government has been saying that at the end of February they're planning to start the rollout, which is earlier than March, which they said originally. I suspect that they won't be able to do it till March, but anyway, they've made a rod for their own back on that front. But we'll wait and see. One of the things that's happened is AstraZeneca have signed a deal with CSL, who own, there's a company in the UK, might be better known to some of you as Aquarius, which is a joint venture between CSL, which is the old Commonwealth Serum Labs here in Australia. It's now a listed company in Australia. They're going to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine in their production line here in Melbourne. In Australia, in Melbourne. So we'll be turning out our own vaccine here from using the Oxford AstraZeneca recipe, if you like. So the plan is very much quarantine workers, anybody who's related to that quarantine space, because that's obviously the weakest point in the Australian story at the moment. And then it will go through the normal sort of channels that we've seen other countries, you know, elderly, etc., going through. In terms of borders opening, very, very unlikely for normal open business travel, leisure travel in 2021. I would say probably mid 2022, you could have a level of confidence. We're hoping that we might be optimistic, and maybe in Q1 2022, Australia will be a little bit more open, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much. That's very exploring in terms of timescales, given some of the things we were discussing in the UK. David, in Singapore, there's a couple of questions asking about how to follow up on your looking forward opportunities. Who would folks contact in order to explore those with you?
Me. So I will put my email address in the is the easy answer, and we'll back that up with Singapore's they've written 23 industry transformational roadmaps, and those have been enhanced from the COVID last year as well, in terms of looking at tech in those various areas. So I'll share my email address now for everybody, and then if there's anybody that wants to get in touch with us, I'll get back to you, and just let me know your industry and your product, and we'll schedule a call.
Brilliant. That's very helpful indeed. And I've got a couple of questions actually in about supply chain challenges, particularly with China, James, noting the huge increase in shipping rates through acute shortages in containers, for example. And the question is, how are businesses both trading with China and operating a major component of their supply chain from China? How are they reacting to that? Are you seeing any evidence of the impact?
Yeah, it's been hugely challenging actually for the past month or so actually on this, and I suspect it won't go away anytime soon. So as one of the colleagues said here is, obviously the combination of crew changeover is an issue, and the acute shortage of containers is also a problem. We found a lot of people are starting to use the Belt Road Initiative, so putting products on trains rather than using ships. And obviously freights if you can afford it. So there are some workarounds, but there are many companies that are coming up with backlogs on this. And if particularly in ports, at the moment there's a vast amount of container ships stuck in Chinese ports, actually from Australia, particularly coal container ships. I think there's about 80 that have been stuck there for the past 9 months. Because of the political situation between the two is not favorable at the moment. So it's something that we're continuously monitoring. There are some companies that have found workarounds, so happy to connect with whoever raised that question and put them in touch with some members who could help.
I know that was Ainsley that was asking that, and we'll certainly try and make sure that we can follow up on that. Also, David, in Sydney, David in Singapore mentioned the CCTPP, but there's also discussions around the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement. Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And we, like Singapore, are members of the CPTPP. Australia and the UK have been negotiating a free trade agreement since June last year. It's progressing really well. There's lots of opportunities for us to work together, and we're very happy to work with our friends both in Singapore and Shanghai, of course, as well along the journey. But we've snuck ahead in the queue in terms of the bilateral. So we're really keen. If you have issues in dealing with Australia at the moment, or if you are dealing with Australia, we'd love to hear from you about what you find good and what you don't find so good. So very keen to hear from any of your members on that front. But yeah, really great opportunity to reshape the opportunity between Australia and the UK. The CPTPP, which is 11 countries across not only Asia, but across into Canada and South America as well, really does lead a great opportunity for the UK to really stamp its global Britain credentials. So we'll look forward to seeing what they come up with and how it works in terms of bilateral arrangement, but also on that sort of more plurilateral, multilateral sort of sense. The other thing is there are loads of opportunities in Australia in just about every sector under the sun at the moment. We are open for business as much as you can be when you're not allowed to come and visit us, which kind of sounds counterintuitive, but believe me, there are huge opportunities. And I'd be really pleased to talk with any of your members that might be interested in the Australian market and taking a foray down here. We will be open at some point, and we will be able to show you our fabulous beaches and our lovely Harbour Bridge and Opera House and Uluru and the Great Barrier Reef and everything else that makes Australia wonderful. Yeah, I'm just going to be really rude just for a moment because I know it's still relatively early over there in Scotland. But it's still 24 degrees and it's 9:15 in the evening here at the moment. So yeah, feel free if you would like to get back into the sunshine to come down and visit us.
Look forward to that opportunity. A shameless plug there, but perfectly valid.
Absolutely.
Perfectly valid. But so I'm going to have to bring it to a close because we've just passed the 10:15 mark. I really want to say thank you enormously to James and to David for giving up a portion of your Friday evening to share with us what has been quite clearly a very different experience of the COVID-19 crisis in your respective cities. We have, I think, learned a lot about how you might want to say we should have handled the crisis in the US and in Europe, or at least elements of how we should have handled it. I hope we'll have learned some lessons from the experience that you have had.